Good afternoon and welcome to Luncheon with Books. All politicians have to work the crowd, you know. So anyway, we're so thrilled to have Steve Holland with us. But first I would like to thank Tracy Kramer for these beautiful roses that she bought just for the Friends of the Library. And I would like to thank the Boonville contingency who came, and I must say you have a wonderful library. I've been there, and that's where I met George Allen and read his book and just laughed out loud. He must have been a great individual. So also, I'd like to welcome Carol Allen. She is actually kin to George Allen. So, and we are standing on the home place of Private John Allen. So this is a historic day. Steve Holland, in case you don't know him, he's one of Miss Sadie's boys.
Amen. Her favorite of 6.
And he grew up on a farm in Lee County, Plantersville, actually. Steve is a graduate of Mississippi State, but he has a master's degree from Ole Miss, where he was the protege of the famous historian, Dr. David Sansing. And Steve is, of course, a successful businessman and the owner of Holland Funeral Home. And he was a representative in the House of Representatives for how many years?
36 very long years.
36 very long years. And Steve supports many philanthropic organizations. Steve is one of those few politicians who actually will read a book. And he's even better at reviewing them, if you want to know the truth. He also plays the piano, and he plays the piano for Unity Presbyterian Church. And he's played for Jimmy Carter at his church. So anyway, he's multi-talented. Steve, when I read the book, I decided that George Allen was a raconteur, and I thought, what local raconteur can I get to review this book? And who did I think of? Steve Holland. Welcome.
Thank you, babe. Well, babe, that was generous, and I appreciate it. Babe's father, Dr. S.J. McDuffie, was my best friend for many years, and I miss him, babe. Every day I have his portrait hanging in my office. That's how much I think of him. But I'm glad to be here today. And Carol, thank you for coming, and the Prentiss County delegation. If I tell a lie, just forget it, by gosh, and go on about your business and so forth. This is not my first rodeo. It seems like Babe wants me to review a book about every year or two, and I don't know why she always gives me political books. I do read something besides political books, but having been in the business a long time and just might be getting back in the business, I enjoy reading them. I really do, and this was a good one. I first read this book in 1977 when I graduated from Mississippi State University with a 2.0 infinity grade point average. Couldn't get a job, interviewed everywhere in the world, and I called my old buddy and my daddy and mama's old buddy, Congressman Jamie Whitten, and said, help. I had been a page for him in 1972, and he liked me and I liked him. And I kept up with him, and Daddy really kept up with him because of his interest in agriculture, and Daddy was a huge farmer. But anyway, one of the first things Mr. Whitten did to me, he said, have you ever heard of George Allen? And I said, no, sir, I haven't. Is he dead or alive? I said, well, he just died. And but he wrote a book, and you need to read it because it reminds me of you. That's just what Jamie Whitten said in 1977. So I did just as he said. As a matter of fact, somewhere in my house with 3,000 books, I have Jamie Whitten's copy of presidents who have known me. Now, Babe and Counselor loaned me their book, and I apologize for this, but the thing is 70 years old, 72 years old. So, I mean, or maybe not, 1960 edition. This was the last. He wrote the first book in 1950, and he signed a contract with Simon & Schuster and, for 2 books. And I guess he just, as we say, ran out of gas. So what he did is added a final part 5, which was his relationship with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he didn't say much about Dwight D. Eisenhower, but I'll speak of that before we leave. But he was literally, bar none, Dwight D. Eisenhower's best friend. And it is phenomenal. It is phenomenal. Prentice County, you should be very proud of the George E. Allen Library. I was in Corinth on Friday giving a speech in memory of the late great speaker Billy McCoy, and I stopped back by and spent the entire morning in your library there, and your librarian was very kind to me and opened the doors and all the papers of George Allen to me. There's over 8,000 manuscripts. There are countless hundreds of letters that George Allen wrote in hand, quill in hand, in cursive, to Dwight D. Eisenhower, Truman, and FDR. And they're fabulous. They're the original letters. She did share with me that they had joined in partnership with the library at Mississippi State, the Mitchell Memorial Library, and they're going to put all that. Do we still have microfiche? I don't know. I got 3 college degrees and I can't run a computer, not going to learn how to run a computer, not interested in a computer, can't stand a cell phone, but they're necessities of life. But anyway, Mississippi State, because these are the only documents they have. So they're going to put them so the whole world can get to them, and I think that is a fabulous idea. Well, the book is Presidents Who Have Known Me, 296 pages. Now, that's sort of an interesting title, and I remember how it sort of, when Jamie Whitten gave me the book, how it sort of struck me as, well, this guy must be pretty darn cocky. Presidents Who Have Known Me. I would think the title should have been Presidents I Have Known. But when you read the book, you find out. Now, I love Carol Allen. We go to church together, and she plays the piano sometime. I play the organ. Dr. Armistead and Miss Sandy, our pastor, mostly. But, and we got a good thing going. If y'all want to attend, it'd be great. But don't make us have to do a building program, because we're the best kept secret in America. The Unity Presbyterian Church, 5 miles east of Plantersville. A beautiful experience. But I just could not help but be struck with the cockiness of this title, and it worried me before I even started reading. Well, it didn't take me long as you read. Let me say this, by the way. All of my archives now are at Mitchell Memorial Library at Mississippi State, and they're actually teaching out of them all the papers that I accumulated in 36 years of the legislature, and I've never been to it, but I'm going to go this next week down to see, I don't know. God knows what may be in there, because I chewed a few governors out along the way and had a lot of publicity and notoriety, just as George Allen did throughout his career, and it's all housed now at the library. And I'm going to make sure they got a copy of this book in that collection too when I go back. But in going through some papers, now this is appropriate simply because Private John Allen was George Allen's uncle. His daddy and Private John, I believe, were brothers, is the way that works. So, or maybe granddaddy, I'm not sure. But anyway, I found a picture from, I believe, Jeff, 1970 or 69, of Olivia Napoli. How many of you remember Olivia Napoli? What a wonderful old soul. And myself laying down in front of the bulldozer. I was 15 when they were about to push down the Private John Allen home. It made the at that time, the Tupelo Daily Journal. So I'm a historical preservationist. I still got the outhouse on the Sadie J, the original outhouse, restored. I don't need it, but I got it. So anyway, I love libraries, and y'all know that. Miss Bertie Patton came to the farm when I was 6 years old. Mama had all the hoe hands out in the cotton patch, and all of us tow-headed boys, all 6 of us. And I remember Miss Bertie driving that 1948 bookmobile and all the dust. We were on the back side of about an 80-acre field. And I remember her getting off that bus. And she had the big hairdo and the real big glasses. And I remember her going straight to my mother, who was just a young one herself then, and said, Miss Holland, I'm Miss Bertie Patton, the Lee County Bookmobile librarian, and I am here to teach your boys and your field hands to read. And that struck me as a phenomenon. And I got on. My brothers wasn't quite into that like I was. They were okay. They can read. But I was fascinated, to say the least. And Miss Bertie took me on the library, and she said to me, Steve, if you'll be here every Thursday afternoon, I'll bring this bookmobile to this farm, because we had a pretty large farm, large group of folks just working the farm. If you'll do that, you may not can go to the world, but I promise you every Thursday I'll bring the world to you. And I count that literally as the basis of whatever success I've ever achieved, or notoriety too, for the matter. But she did teach me a love of reading. And that first year, I read 45 books in the private John Allen home in the Christopher Robin room. And I still have my blue ribbon from that. So there you have it. I'm still working on my book, Don't Die. 2023 is the year. I just feel it coming. I do 500 funerals a year at my funeral home. I'm very busy. I don't have my mama by my side anymore, so I'm having to work a lot harder than I ever have. I work 60 to 80 hours a week, but I don't need much sleep. You can sleep when you're old and dead. And so I just stay up all the time and I read, and I'm going to get it done. It will be 50 years of me being in funeral business on May the 14th, 2023. Can you believe it, Camille? But I started when I was 17, so there you have it. Well, let's get back to George Allen. To say he was an interesting character is putting it very mildly. And I told you about, well, George left $150,000 to build the library in Booneville, and it was just enough back in that day, which, can you imagine? That'd be $1 million building, I guess, or better. Today, it's a very imposing library. It could use some paint and so forth like that, so if any of you are city leaders, y'all might want to put a meal on or something to paint it up a little bit. But beyond that, all libraries sometimes need a little work. They constantly need work, because thank God they're used. But he left this money perfectly designated to build a library in Prentiss County to house his papers. And most all of his papers are there in a room this size, probably, maybe even a little bit larger, and it's very imposing. And if you've got time and you're ever in Booneville, I would certainly recommend that you go by and look at that. Well, George Edward Allen was born in between Booneville and Baldwin on a farm on February the 29th, 1896, and he died April the 23rd, 1973, at the age of 77 at his home in Palm Springs, California. Interestingly enough, I took a little tour. I've been in the Booneville Cemetery, unfortunately, way too many times. But I found his grave, and it's a pretty interesting deal. The Allen marker is what you would expect it to be. Well, it's not even on here, but it's this big, imposing Civil War-looking marker. And then George's is about 10 by 20 at its foot that simply says George E. Allen. And then it's got his date of birth and death. He was a leap year baby. Lawyer, businessman, author, friend, advisor to presidents Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. It's good enough. He's dead as he'll ever be. I don't want you take that back. I was about to put it in my possession. But yeah, his forebears were very prominent in Northeast Mississippi, the Allens, and they made great contributions in business, law, commerce, and so forth. You are certainly the least of this, Carol, but from what George told about all of his family, they were one of the cockiest families in Northeast Mississippi. I mean, really, I've never seen anybody think so highly of themselves as he did, but by the time I read the book again and refreshed myself, he had a right to be cocky. Some people do, you know. Some people do, and he wore it well, I'd like to say in the end. He admitted that immodesty is a family tradition, and he felt very duty-bound to carry it on the whole of his life. The cockiness is cleverly reflected in his writing style. Sarcasm is prevalent, and he does not shy away from aggrandizement, including aggrandizing himself in many instances. But after all, he says, I was born an Allen. Alan appropriately divides the book in 5 parts, which includes all the years and seasons of his life. And I don't know, I'm a Genesis person about everything. I love to know where you started. I guess that's a Southern tradition in me. Who's your mama and them? That's the first question I ask any stranger, no matter where I am. Do I know your mama and them? Who was your granddaddy? So I'm a Genesis person, and I like to know where he started. And he spent probably more time, really, in section 1 talking about his upbringing in Prentiss County than he did some of the other sections talking about his world travels, his sitting on 30 boards and commissions of some of the most powerful companies in America before he retired. But it's divided from his birth to age 25. And interestingly enough, he spent a lot of time writing about it. But he wasn't thrilled at all about being a Prentiss County native, which sort of disappointed me. Now, I stand to be challenged on that if you want to, but I'm just going by his writings. His last statement was he never liked school and he never liked growing up in Prentiss County, so he got out as soon as he could. As a matter of fact, he was sent to boarding school when he was 14. To the boarding school in Tennessee. I forget the name of it. But who? It wasn't Columbia. I can't remember. I may have it here in the notes in a minute. But that's where it was, yes. Thank you, Jane. And he could not stand school. His daddy died when he was 8. And he was pretty much by that time already a rascal. He was ambitious. He was jolly. He did not like being sent to school or forced to go to school. He went anyway because his parents made him go. And I guess because of his sort of riotous nature, they sent him at age 14 to McCallie, is that what you said? Mm-hmm. In Tennessee. And he basically flunked out of that because he didn't like that either. But the Allens had enough money that they said, you shall board there whether you go to school or not. And the McCallie people, and he talks about that later, his principal wound up being a great friend of FDR as well at McCallie. And they reunited later and shared a lot of wonderful stories together about those years. Allen went on to say that for a time, Presidents Who Have Known Me was his favorite reading ever, the best book he had ever read. And he said, I liked it because it displayed my hidden depth. Allens are hams, no doubt about it. Allen wound up being of counsel to 3 presidents, or more especially 2. He received his first political appointment from FDR as a commissioner for the District of Columbia. Now, commissioner is mayor of the District of Columbia. There were 3 of them, so he said, I'm 1/3 mayor of the District of Columbia. As he said, the other 2, and he'd call their names, were a Harvard and a Princeton graduate, and he said they were stuck up that nobody could approach him, so he really was the mayor because of his gregarious personality and the fact that he got out and mixed and mingled, and yes, babe, went to every table and spoke to everybody because it's a proper fitting and Christian thing to do. So he was wildly popular as the 1/3 mayor or commissioner of the District of Columbia. He liked this assignment very much, but it was in the time of the approaching Depression, and so things weren't going too good in the country. And this post-Depression, when he was appointed mayor just after, so he was the one who would go to the food lines and literally distribute food. I mean, you're talking about what we'd call a good old boy politician today. He slapped the flesh. He loved and hugged and kissed the flesh. And he just became wildly popular because of that in the post-Depression. And of course, being born a Democrat, I got a speech, if y'all ever want to hear it sometime, that's called Jesus Was a Democrat, but we won't go into that today, Jane. Actually, when I was in politics, I'd have to go every Sunday morning. I'd be just so tired on Sunday morning to some Baptist church, to a brotherhood meeting and speak. And this just got to be where I was going all over North Mississippi doing these speeches. And so I finally sat down one day and wrote a speech called Jesus Was a Democrat. And I gave it right across the street at the First Baptist Church up here. And I hadn't been invited to a Baptist church since. And being Methodist Presbyterian, I hadn't missed it. I love the Baptists. God made a lot of them, and so it's okay with me, but that wasn't where I found myself. Well, one story that he had in the book, the superintendent of the boarding school, labor was a big part of your teaching at the boarding school. So George Allen, being George Allen, was tasked with plowing a mule. And he plowed the mule for half a day. And he finally fell out, frail, in the field. Went to the superintendent, begged the superintendent to make him never do that again as long as he lived. And the superintendent obliged, and he wound up spending the rest of that summer in Colorado Springs, laying up, basking in the sun at the Biltmore. Silver spoon, wouldn't you say, Carol? A little bit. But anyway. Well, in 1912, at the fabulous age of 16, some guy from Prentiss County that I can't remember was going to be a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. They got sick, and at the ripe old age of 16, George Allen was appointed to be a delegate from Mississippi to the Democratic Convention. And boy, did he show out. He was not for Woodrow Wilson at all, not any. And of course, Woodrow Wilson ultimately was the nominee and won the presidency. It humiliated George to no end, and he, for a brief moment, decided that he would lay down the mantle of politics because he didn't like losing. He wanted to win. Well, thank God he didn't. He ended that chapter, I told you, here's what he ended, the identical sentence that he wrote. And that's about all I remember, or at least want to remember, about my youth in Prentiss County. Now, he brought his bones, somebody did, back to Prentiss County to be buried by his mom and daddy. By the way, Ms. Allen's not there, and I tried to find out where she is, and parts unknown. I don't think, he never referred to her, but about 3 times in the book. I don't think it was what you call a loquacious marriage, but it was a marriage of convenience, and it helped him out, and he had plenty of money in the end, so she got to buy anything she wanted, and I don't know where her bones are, somewhere in the country, I guess. But anyway, he's in the Allen family lot there. He could not, after he got out of the boarding school, figure out which college he wanted to go to. He went to like 4 different colleges and stayed a semester apiece. I think it was his rebellious nature of fighting going to school anyway, but he finally graduated. He never said from which college. And he was accepted. He sat for the admission to the Cumberland Law School, and he was accepted, and he met the requirements, and ultimately, as he said, quote unquote, learned enough law to pass the bar exam. My diploma has been so little used that it's almost every day as good as new. You lawyers might know something about that, counselor. Well, George loved sports, but he didn't play much sports. He was a pretty good baseball player growing up, but he was always a team manager for everything, football, basketball, baseball, and so forth, and it put him in the throes of the team. So this was one of the funniest stories that he told. While he was at Cumberland Law School, they had just the year before disbanded their football team, number one, because they wasn't worth a flip, and number two, because it was taking away too much money. Can you imagine a sports program taking too much money from academics? My goodness. But anyway, they had one contract left that they absolutely, football team or not, had to play Georgia Tech. So George went to the president of Cumberland University and convinced him that he could get up enough guys to go to Atlanta and challenge Georgia Tech because it was a $7,000 contract in 1918 or somewhere thereabout. which would be probably, I don't know how much today, but a lot of money that Cumberland didn't have, and they were going to have to just pay the money if they didn't play the game. So smart aleck George got all these boneheads together, and here they trip over to Atlanta to play. They were outnumbered, they were out-trained, they were outsized. Georgia Tech was good. Grantland Rice was the coach. And so here they hit the field. Grantland told in his book that the greatest individual play by Cumberland was when fullback. He was coaching. Allen was coaching, but the boys got so hurt he had to wind up go in and play himself. And when George Allen fullback circled right in for a 6-yard loss. And George tells in the book that one of his players fumbled the ball, and a fullback, and he hollered to George, "Fall on the ball, George." At which time George hollered back, "Hell, I didn't drop it. You dropped it. You fall on it." The ultimate score of that game is the largest defeat still in the history of college sports. Georgia Tech 222, Cumberland 0. They never even scored a touchdown. So that ended old George's football career. Interestingly enough, he came back to have his first law practice in Okolona. And I have a funeral home in Okolona, been down there 35 years, and it's a very interesting town still. But in that day, it was a metropolis. It was thriving. It was the source of cotton, railroad money. There was just a lot of money there, so George fell right into that. And there were 3 lawyers in Okolona at the time. Stovall was one of them. The Stovall family still owns a lot of land around Okolona. And I forget who the other guy was, but he told the story of how he was in the courtroom and some guy was charged with something and he had no money, so the judge said, "Okay, there's 2 lawyers in the courtroom. There's one in his office here in Okolona." Said, "You have the right to have a lawyer, so which one do you want?" He said, "I believe I'll take the one in the office that I've not seen." So it sort of spoke of his legal interests, really. He was not much of a lawyer at all. But it taught him. I've learned that lawyers have a wonderful education. And you don't have to be a lawyer if you're a lawyer. You can do a lot of other things, and it makes you real smart and real educated. So what George learned in Okolona more than a law practice was the Merchant and Commerce Bank was the largest bank at the time in Okolona. And he developed a friendship, as George Allen did throughout his life, with the top. Whatever you were, if you were chairman of the board, he wanted you. And then he'd trickle down all the rest of the people in the organization. So he sought out the president of the bank, and the president of the bank happened to be a huge poker player. And they developed a poker game in the second floor of the Merchants Bank in Okolona every afternoon. And George Allen literally got rich, so to say, in the day, playing poker on the second floor, so much so that the banker allowed George Allen to use the poker money, or the poker game, as collateral for all kinds of loans. That's pretty good. You're pretty shrewd when you can do that. So he served in World War I with a commission from the notorious Theodore G. Bilbo, Mississippi's governor at the time, and the staunchest enemy his uncle John Allen had, Congressman John Allen had. They absolutely hated each other and were always into it. He attained the rank of lieutenant, but he wanted to be promoted, and the Army wouldn't promote him. So at this time, his best friend and the guy who wound up being best man in his wedding, Senator Pat Harrison from Mississippi, the guy who famously said, "There's no reason, people, to cross a toll bridge when there's a free bridge to cross." Pat Harrison served Mississippi ably and with distinction for 32 years in the United States Senate and was almost nominated as vice president, but he didn't make it. He was the majority leader in the United States Senate for several years and third in line to succeed to the presidency. But anyway, Pat put all of his weight toward getting him a higher rank, and the fact of the matter is they finally got a letter back from the Army that said, "Promotion, hail, you're discharged. You have an honorable discharge. Get out of here." So that ended his military career, and he couldn't stand Okolona. He had bled Okolona for everything he could bleed it for, and He was almost becoming a rascal because he was taking everybody's money in poker games. So he found an ad somewhere. It certainly wasn't the internet. We didn't have the internet in 1919. But he found an ad for a law partner in Greensburg, Indiana. And he said, being a barrister of great renown, I'm going to go to Indiana and make a new life for myself. Well, he got up there and the law firm was nothing but a collection agency. So he was very disappointed about that, but he stayed there just long enough to meet the chairman of the board of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. And guess what? They got to be such friends. The chairman of the board appointed him the executive director of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. So he moves on to Indianapolis, and he's meeting folks, and he's flying all over the country and going to D.C. and just meeting all these big wheels, and he loved it, and he got so good at it that the Louisville, Kentucky Tourism Council hired him there to be their executive director and to lure tourism to Louisville, and he aced that job as well. And in the process, he had learned to stay at historic hotels. He loved historic hotels. And so the manager of the Congress Hotel in Chicago recruited him to get in the hotel business. And he thought that would be a good twist and a good change for him. And so he got in the hotel business. He went and ran the Congress Hotel, which was the hottest spot in Chicago at the time. Of course, George Allen's going to be at the hottest spot of everything in his life. And he just met thousands of people all over the country and the world in that position. And it's the roaring 20s by now, and everybody's making money and living the good life. And George took full advantage of that and got into a venture capital group to buy hotels. And at their zenith, this group owned like 300 hotels all across America, and he became a multiple millionaire through this experience, and he's in his 20s. He's in his 20s. He ultimately moved to their property in D.C., the hottest property, the Park Hotel, the Wardman Park as it was called in the day, which is this beautiful hotel. I used to go to parties there when I worked with Mr. Whitten, and it's just so opulent and so beautiful. And it just literally hangs over Rock Creek Parkway near Georgetown, the Georgetown area of D.C. And he became the manager there, and of course half the senators and half the House of Representatives made the Wardman Park Hotel their headquarters. So what did that do? Put him right in the thick of national politics. And he was good to these folks. He was bumping shoulders with Washington's elite. And he amassed a fortune, as I said, during this time. But the fortune probably wasn't as important to him as the contacts that he made. Part two is 1929 to World War II. And by this time, George Allen has just literally established himself as a force to contend with in Washington, D.C., the hottest person there. He described D.C. in 1929 as an overgrown American country town dangling in limbo between the North and the South, between metropolitan urbanity and rural parochialism, between the 19th and 20th century, with the pace of life as slow as a trot. So it's sort of like he thought it was a country town, but it really wasn't. He said the biggest excitement he had during that period was the fight between the vice president's wife and the Speaker of the House's wife on which one, when they were on a dais together, would sit the highest. And it became such an issue that for 6 months it was raging debate in Washington, D.C. And George finally stepped in and solved the thing, saying the vice presidency is more important than the speaker by the Constitution. So, Madam Vice President's wife, you shall sit at the highest point. And he got a lot of press all across the country for that. Well, one thing that happened in 1930, I believe it was, he had gotten so high in the hotel chain and in Washington, D.C., that the corporation had afforded him a limo and a driver. And it was the hottest limo in Washington, of course. And a lady lived across the street from the deal, and she got enamored by the limo. And she finally got courage enough to inquire about who was riding around every day in the limo. That lady quickly became Ms. George Allen. So that's how he met her. And I think he stayed in the limo from what I read the rest of his life, and she stayed at home. She didn't really stay at home. He wrote a little bit about her, and she lived the good life, believe you me. So anyway, national politics had become important, and so George is in the thick of it. He did say throughout the book, he would refer back, even though he said he did not like his childhood growing up in Prentiss County, he often credited his success with what he learned as a country boy from Prentiss County. So I don't know which is true. I think he was just a rebellious kid. I don't think he really disdained his growing up as much as he wrote about in the book, and he went to great pains to write about that. Well, we move forward, and he tells also about a guy that came to stay at the Wardenman Park Hotel who was a British elite. And as I said, it overlooked Rock Creek Parkway, and this British guy had never seen a lightning bug. And he just became enamored with lightning bugs. Well, the cabinet member that was hosting this British elitist invited George just in case he ran out of something to say to this guy that he didn't know. And George could always say anything to anybody. He was that kind of guy. The elitist said, Mr. Cabinet, would you please tell me about these lightning bugs? I want to take them back to England, to Surrey. And the guy scratched his head and probably some other part of his body at the same time, said, I know nothing about it. And George popped up and said, oh my gosh, I have a drink about twice a week with the guy who is head of lightning bugs at the Department of Agriculture. So here comes George. He takes the Englishman over to the Department of Agriculture and sets up an appointment. And the guy, the bureaucrat at the Department of Agriculture, had been studying lightning bugs for all these years, was just bowled over by all of this. And they worked out some kind of deal for the guy to take lightning bugs back to England. But anyway, the expert replied after the Englishman bowed down to him and said, this is going to be the most beautiful thing that ever happened to England. He said, let me thank you. This is the bureaucrat saying this to the Englishman. Let me thank you. I've been here 35 years studying lightning bugs, and this is literally the first time anybody has ever entered my office and asked me about anything. Typical bureaucrat. I think there's a lot of those still stuck in buildings, don't you, in Washington, D.C. Well, he loved his D.C. assignment, but he loved better the fact that his association with Pat Harrison took him to the Oval Office, very frequent with FDR. He did not personally like FDR. He said he was too stiff-shirted, too elitist. Can you imagine George Allen talking about somebody being too elitist? But he loved the fact of his program. Interestingly enough, and I did not know this as many political history books as I've read, it was Pat Harrison, the senior senator from Mississippi, and George Allen that convinced Franklin Delano Roosevelt to start the Works Progress Administration, which wound up being a $5.8 billion program that built Church Street School, oh my gosh, Legion Lake, Tom Bigby State Park, all across the country. Those two guys are the two guys that convinced FDR to do that. So if he did nothing else in his life, he can credit being a big part of saving the nation after the Great Depression to an old country boy from, Pat Harrison was from the Gulf Coast and Allen from Prentiss County. He actually, FDR, in announcing the New Deal, the WPA program, gave full credit in his first press conference to George Allen and Pat Harrison and turned around and asked George to address the crowd. And of course, he was flabbergasted. It was his first really great experience with a microphone. And so he was written up all over the country, and then here comes the press, and da-di-da-di-da-da. He gets further and further up to Maslow's hierarchy. But anyway, that also put him in the forefront of being sought out. He was made chairman of the board of some home insurance corporation, which at the time was one of the largest insurance companies in the nation, and the salary from that was enormous. but he wound up on 30, I guess we'd say today, Fortune 500 boards of directors. He did tell about, he was philanthropic as well. He was a very philanthropic man. He didn't hoard all this money. He gave a lot of it away. And he was one of the initial leaders, George Allen, in founding the March of Dimes. Pretty interesting. And it was his idea to ask Americans to send as many dimes as they could to Washington, D.C. to fight polio and other diseases like that, Janice. And so the fact of the matter was, I think they, in that day, I'm not sure what the year was, but they raised $30 million in dimes to fight polio. Pretty remarkable for a country boy from Prentiss County. He told about a trip to Ireland because World War II was about to happen. And he went on behalf of the American Red Cross to Ireland. That was another board that he sat on, was very instrumental in its leadership. And he met with British officials to see how the American Red Cross could aid not only the American people that would be there in the war, but their people as well. And in the process, he got to meet with all the big folks in Ireland, and through the ambassador who was his host to Ireland, the American ambassador to Ireland. And they got a little tipsy at an Irish pub one night, and George Allen had already met Dwight D. Eisenhower when he was in the military. And they connected, but not like they ultimately connected. And he just made this wall-eyed, probably half-drunk prediction that Dwight D. Eisenhower was going to lead the Allied forces in World War II. And lo and behold, he knew not what he talked about. He had no factual basis for it. The very next day, Dwight D. Eisenhower was announced as the leader of the Allied forces in World War II. So George Allen took full credit for it. And that made news around the world. All right, 1944, the Democratic National Convention has happened. I got to move on. I like talking. If y'all notice. Let's talk about, he wound up, as I told you, in the New Deal and the WPA, but he was for Harry Truman. And he wound up basically being Harry Truman's implied, not official, but implied campaign manager for president. And they got to be obviously mighty close. They traveled together all across America to big cities and rural towns, and they got to be best buds. Interesting enough, George, as encouraging and as well as he plotted Truman's strategy to win, he said he told him every day, "You'll never beat Dewey. You'll never beat Dewey." And by golly, he did. So Truman did not hold that against him. And Truman invited him in to be in his inner circle, of course, as he begun his presidency and set up his administration. And he asked Allen to be the director of the, in essence, the largest bank. Let me see what the name of it was at the time. Reconstruction Finance Corporation. They loaned multiple billions of dollars out. And here's, again, a country boy from Prentiss County, head of the largest bank in the world. What did it do for George? Ching-a-ching-a-ching-a-ching-a-ching. Now, he went to great pains in this book that said he did no political favors for Truman's cronies. And that he was a perfectly honest man, and I believe he was. I really do. I have no reason. As a matter of fact, he spent page after page trying to justify the fact that the American people ought not to assume that every one of their politicians are crooks, because they're not, and I like that because I'm not a crook. I can be mean, but I'm not a crook. Allen was offered the job as chairman of the National Democratic Party. He refused it because he loved Truman so much, and he stayed with him. He stayed 1 year in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he loaned so much money And the press got against him so much that he walked into Truman and he said, "I promised you a year, and the year's up today, and I resign officially." And Truman begged him to stay there, but he wouldn't. And he left that with a good bit of tarnish on his name, if you will. But yet, history has proven that it was an agency that was run with remarkable accountability and transparency and that kind of thing. He refused to take any office with Dwight D. Eisenhower, Eisenhower being a Republican, Allen being a Democrat. The man needs to be living today to bring these two diverging parties together, because if you really study this book and its great impact, George Allen's great impact on this country, he was a middleman. He brought both sides together to the middle, and that's where policy is best. I've always thought that. That's a role that I played for 36 years in the legislature, and it's something that you got to have, but we don't have any of that today, and I regret that he's not amongst us. Folks could study his life and this story and learn a lot about folks getting together. Well, Eisenhower begged him, just begged him in the last, this is the 1960. He didn't write the second book for Simon & Schuster. He just added the story of Eisenhower in 2 chapters, and they were not very long, because he said, "I am so emotional about Eisenhower, I can't even write about him." He thought he was the greatest man he had ever met. He thought Truman, FDR, then Truman, then Eisenhower. But Eisenhower and Allen played golf and bought racehorses together and partnered and wound up buying massive adjoining farms in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where they lived out their last days together there in Palm Springs, where he ultimately died. In California was his second home. But he didn't tell many stories about Eisenhower, but he went to very great pains to talk about the decency of this man, the uncommon decency. And he was highly reprimanded by the Democratic Party for affiliating so much with Eisenhower, but they were best friends. And in the George E. Allen Library in Boonville, there is one of the best paintings that Dwight D. Eisenhower gave George Allen of himself. It's the painting you see when you see the paintings of American presidents. That's in Boonville, Mississippi right now. And in turn, Eisenhower in his latter days became an artist himself, and he did a portrait of George Allen, which is equally as good. And they hang side by side, Dr. Griffin, in the library there in Boonville, so y'all go by and see. He just basically said he was an admirer and always had a eyeball-to-eyeball view of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was all good. Mamie and Ms. Allen became best friends. They traveled the country while Dwight and George were playing golf and bridge and fishing and doing all those things. But bottom line is they really liked each other. The book is Presidents Who Have Known Me. Here's the cover. Sorry, Gratz, I'll try to get you a new book, but I don't know where in the devil you can get books like this. It was written in 1950 and 60, but there's the cover of it. We've got some pictures here, and if you want to look over here before you leave, you're pretty good when you get on the cover of Time magazine. That's hot. That's right below getting on the cover of Rolling Stone. Time magazine. And this is this is about his efforts, I believe, with the WPA, and it's the story of how he and Pat Harrison from Mississippi basically wrote that program. That's all I got to say. I'll be glad to review another book if you'll just assign it to me, babe. I'm scared to cross you, and so whenever you're ready for the next, just give me about a 3-day notice. Thank y'all for being here. I appreciate it.
I would like to ask you to stay for just a little while. Lisa Reed is going to introduce what we'll be reading for Tupelo Reads. So.
Thank you, babe. And that was fascinating, Steve. I enjoyed that. I looked at Bonnie Webb and said, "Have you ever heard of him before?" And she said, "No, because I'm not from here." So I thought, maybe I was the only one, but I really enjoyed that. Jack was sorry he couldn't come. Well, I'm excited to be in front of all you readers to announce our book for February of 2023. And actually, there are going to be 2 books this year by the same, here it is, by the same author. The program is going to be February 1st here at the Lee County Library for lunch, and the author will be that morning at Tupelo High School. So on behalf of the committee, Margaret Gratz is here, and Catherine Mize, Virginia Tolliver, there you are, Bonnie Webb are here. Our author is named Jamie Ford, and the books are Hotel at the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, and his latest book, The Many Daughters of Afong Moy. Jamie Ford is from Montana. He is the great-grandson of a Nevada mining pioneer, Min Chung, who immigrated from China to San Francisco in 1865, and he adopted the name Ford, which Jamie said was to everybody's everlasting confusion after that. But Jamie Ford grew up near Seattle, near Chinatown in Seattle, and both these books are set there. This first one takes place during World War II. This second one is, the more recent one is actually in August of this year, takes place with many different settings, which you'll see when you read the book. But he has never been to Mississippi, and he's very excited about coming here. I told the agent that I used, I said, we loved William Kent Kruger so much last year, and give me somebody like that. And this is a very well-met person. I think he loves to come into a community and get to know a community, so I think he'll be very enjoyable. Some of you may have read this book 10 years ago when it came out. Our book club did, and we really loved it. This latest book was published in August of this year to much fanfare, and Jenna Hager-Bush chose it as her Today Show book club book. And she is actually undertaken to be the executive producer of a miniseries about it. So it's very current right now. She said this is a beautiful book about motherhood and what we leave to people that come after us. Jamie is supposed to be a great speaker, great sense of humor. He writes, the books are serious, but he supposedly has a wicked sense of humor, and he is looking forward to coming. So a fun thing is I looked on his website, and his upcoming events are the Texas Book Festival in November in Austin. It's very prestigious. And then the Miami Book Festival in December, and Tupelo, Mississippi at the Lee County Library in February. So we're in good company. So that's exciting. So y'all start reading, and please join us in February for this event. Okay.